I'm not gonna talk about the actual battles and all that stuff because all you got to do is turn on the History Channel and it's like they're bombing Germany right now. So I mean, basically, I think they call the History Channel the War Channel. All right, but it's if you want to learn about the battles and all that, look at that. But what we're going to talk about is um, the effect really that World War II had on American life. Okay, and the one thing just to start off with is I will say that World War II is probably one of the watershed moments in American history. What I mean by watershed means is that everything changes. Everything changes because of this war. The Civil War was the same, right? The Civil War basically created a completely different country than had existed before the Civil War, right? And the same thing happens here. And the way that it happens is that um, the the up until the time of the Civil War, there were undercurrents of conflict that were kind of hidden. They were kept under the radar essentially. One of them was civil rights. Okay, that there was Jim Crow and there was discrimination all over the place, right? And everybody knew about it, but nobody talked about it. And so because of that, it really wasn't a problem, right? But what happens with World War II, as you guys saw in that movie Los Mineros, right, is that when we call upon everybody to participate in the war, then everybody's going to demand a place at the table after the war, right? So World War II is going to then basically open the door to the civil rights movement. All right. One of the things that, for example, that happens is that black people were joining the military, black people were going to work in war industries, but they were still discriminated against. And this guy, A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the Porter Cars Union, organized a march on Washington. The March on Washington was supposed to be where black people marched on Washington to protest racism. But you'll recall that Roosevelt had framed the war against Germany and Japan as a war against racism, right? So how could you fight a war against racism when racism is your own besetting evil, right? And so what happens is that in order to prevent the march, Roosevelt actually signs an order that ends racial discrimination in industry. Okay, now it ends it legally. It doesn't actually end it in practice for quite some time, right? But at least this is a movement towards towards civil rights. You guys follow what I'm saying? And it wouldn't have happened without World War II. Same thing with women's right. We see women went to work in the factories in World War One. Women go to work in the factories in World War II. Uh, After World War One, women went right back to the kitchen, as you guys saw in that movie, The 20s, right? But after World War II, they say, I'm not going back to the kitchen. I want to do whatever I want. I'm not going to be a second class citizen anymore, right? And so we see the beginning then of the women's rights movement, all right? And then immigration becomes a huge problem because the United States, American men like the men in the Grapes of Wrath, okay, who are working in the fields in California, are now going off to war or are going to work in war-related industries, and so there's a need for people to work in the fields, and the United States makes agreement with foreign countries that their citizens can come to the United States and work. It's called the Bracero program, and that they would work in the United States and make money in the United States. And then um, one of the once the war was over, they would go back to Mexico or wherever they came from, right? But here's where this becomes a problem. It's because of the American Constitution. The American Constitution says that anybody born in the United States is a citizen. And so when these braceros come from Mexico to the United States and they have children, those children are citizens. And so after the war's over, the government saying, well, you guys are all here illegally, go back, right? Well, they weren't here illegally when they came, and they had kids, and those kids are not here illegally either because they're citizens. You follow what I'm saying? So this creates the whole issue of so-called illegal immigration, right? They were illegal, like they were illegal when they came, but they were illegal when the United States didn't need them anymore, right? You follow what I'm saying? All right, and then finally, we had already mentioned the Japanese internment camps, which was incredibly racist. The only thing that we can say about that is that race was a factor in it, but it wasn't the only factor. Because if you'll recall, there was the same kind of a backlash against Germans during World War I, and that wasn't necessarily a racist backlash. So what we couch in racism often isn't any more than just fear, right? And we saw it with the Irish, we saw it with Eastern Europeans, saw it with Jews and Catholics, right? And now we see it with the Japanese, okay? Or we see it with the Hispanics today or Muslims, right? You guys get what I'm saying? Questions, comments about any of this? All right. So the point here then is that the war itself, even though the United States is going to come out of the war the most powerful and the most prosperous country on earth, it will lay itself open to conflict that will, by the end of the 1960s, lead to a real social disorder in the United States. Okay, and that's really what we're going to be talking about pretty much for the rest of the course. All right, you guys are with me? Questions, comments? Some people have argued that by 1968, the United States was one of the least politically stable countries in the world because there were political assassinations going on, riots in the streets. The United States was fighting an unpopular war, right? Um, and there was a lot of disaffection, disunity in the United States, all right? And it all comes out of this moment of triumph of the United States. We'll talk briefly about the legacy. Well, as I mentioned already, the United States emerges as the most powerful nation, but unlike after World War I, Americans see it as their duty to take on the role of defenders of democracy, partially because because the Cold War is really it comes to the forefront even before really the end of World War II. Okay, we'll talk more about that on a different day. But what the Cold War essentially was a conflict, an ideological conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the ideology was based on economics because the Soviet Union was communist and was trying to spread communism. And the United States was capitalist and was trying to defend capitalism. Okay, you guys are with me? Okay, but it's couched in the terms of if you're an American, it's democracy versus communism or totalitarianism. And if you're a Russian, it's democracy because communism in its final form is theoretically democratic, right? Okay, so it's a war between it's a conflict between democracy and imperialism. They're going to say that American imperialism essentially is the last stage of capitalism, right? Okay, so that's how it's caught. That's how it's framed rhetorically and ideologically. But the reality after World War II was that all of the European powers lost their empires, meaning that the British had to give up India, the French ended up having to give up Southeast Asia, and both of the countries had to give up their holdings in Africa, right? And when these countries become independent, this is what's called decolonization, right? When these countries become independent, and the British and the French and the Germans and whoever was in control before leave, they leave behind countries that are devastated by colonialism. Their economies no longer exist, essentially, right? Because their economy is framed basically for the support of the economy in the mother country. If the mother country is no longer there, then the economy collapses, right? You guys follow what I'm saying? All right. So there's going to be, and this really ends up being a kind of a conflict between rich countries and poor countries. But it's going to get caught up in the Cold War, the ideological issue, because the Russians are going to well, actually, both Russians and Americans are going to be trying to court these countries that are recently independent. And that's going to then lead to physical war. It happens in Asia, in, say, Afghanistan, and it also happens in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, right? So American involvement in Vietnam, Americans went into Vietnam thinking that they were saving the world for democracy, but what they really were doing was supporting a colonial regime, which we'll talk again about on a different day, right? And that support for the colonial regime meant that the people were not on board with what the Americans were doing. We went in there saying we're here to save you, and they said we don't want to be saved. You guys get what I'm saying? Not everybody, but a lot of them. And that's part of this that you're going to be reading coming up as another document set that you'll be reading. Okay. All right. Questions, comments about any of that? And then finally, the last thing, as I mentioned, as with the song at the beginning, that it became possible after World War II for the world to be destroyed. I mean, if we look at World War I, it was a horrible war. Millions of people died, but the world went on. But with the introduction of nuclear weapons, it becomes possible to destroy the entire world, all the people of the world, right? This idea, I know it's kind of a theme nowadays of the post-apocalyptic, meaning that the apocalypse happens and there's people that are still scrounging around. That ain't going to happen. The only people that will survive a nuclear war are cockroaches, right? They're not people, obviously. Okay, but the idea here is that this makes it possible now for the whole world to be destroyed, and people know this, right? And so it's going to create what they call an age of anxiety. People are anxious about the fact that the world might end at any time if somebody just pushes the button, and this nuclear anxiety gets tied up with the Cold War because both the United States and the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons, right? So I want you guys to think about when you're reading that book, the Good War. The last story that I assigned you guys was Street Corner Kids, and think about what this issue of nuclear anxiety has to do with those street corner kids.